Welcome to Cypher After Hours. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being a supporting member. We're really excited to go into the extended show for Olympus Mons on Mars. It gets a little wild and crazy here, so buckle up, bring some popcorn. There's going to be some interesting stories, I think, about a distant ancient civilization traveling from one planet to another in ways that aren't conventional. So we're going to go into a bit of what we alluded in the main show, which is what is underneath Olympus Mons, that huge mountain, because both of us, David and I, described these enormous catacombs underneath and what's there. We're going to go into that. We're also going to be describing some of the parallels that we discovered here on Earth, the formations and even some of the similarities in these formations that are actually found in Egypt. I'm going to talk a bit about the religion, which we found in more detail. And if you're familiar with the Merkaba, that's going to be a key element to this. So we have a wild show, I think. We're going to go deep into the woo. So strap in, enjoy, and Emily, maybe you can set us off on the right course. Where should we start?
Well, both of you had this notion of both an attractor and an emitter in your sessions. David, maybe you can share a little bit about what data you got around that piece, the attractor and the emitter, and how that relates to reincarnation, or maybe something along those lines.
Sure. Brett and I both wrote the word attractor in our sessions. An attractor is remote viewing jargon, really. It's like a magnet that draws your attention. Usually you would identify what it is and go, oh, there's a life form over here, or there's a structure over here that is attracting me. But I just wrote attractor, like thung, glommed over there. And I'm like, well, I've been attracted by something, but what is this? Which is, I don't think I've ever done that before. It's a weird thing to happen. And that took me to this central theme or focal point of coming together. And I think what we're looking at here is this priest class. They're engaged in a joint enterprise that's ritualistic, somber. This is where I said, nobody is laughing. It's convergent. Lots of people, like at a ceremony or something, and they're each bringing something to a central point. Here I had an AOL of DNA, thinking like maybe this is like a Noah's Ark kind of thing, but it could be something a little bit more esoteric. So I say this is fundamental. It's really serious for them. It's somber. It's not optional. There's one path, and this is it. But they're hopeful for the future. They've got a desired outcome that they're looking forward to, and then things get dark and gloomy again, because there's an ending, a conclusion, like a black hole. Everything shrinks, goes dark, disappears, fades away. And the fading away is it's like when your camera runs out of battery or runs out of film. It's like everything lost its energy. So this could be the final death of the Martian civilization. I think we reckon there were survivors. There were some left behind on Mars after this insane space laser plasma volcano cataclysm event. And I think eventually they just ran out of resources completely. And this ceremony that I'm looking at here is kind of the final living people packing themselves into their occult lifeboat and zooming off.
Yeah, I had something similar where I think the remnants eventually died out. If there were survivors, it was very few, but I don't think that was part of the plan. I think the original part of the plan after this group genocide of the civilization, there was supposed to be more. There was supposed to be a class of people that were still left, and there was enough of them to propagate that they could survive on the resources that were left long enough to then relocate to a different place and start civilization anew. But I believe that because the experiment, because of the actual activity that occurred at Olympus Mons ran out of control, too much damage was done and a whole lot more people died as a result, that it couldn't occur how they expected. So this idea of like the battery running out on a camera fits almost exactly with my feeling of the situation. Is that too much damage was done, and so the whole thing basically went up in smoke as far as their plan. However, there were things deep underground, just like I called it an attractor as well. And so it was more than just my remote viewing attention was attracted to it. The thing itself, an inherent property of the thing underground, is being an attractor. And well, what it's attracting, though, well, I guess I'll get into that in just a moment here.
So, yeah, whether or not they were doing this in the intended fashion, like your data matches up with what I got. I just saw like fewer than 100 people, I would say, and they're all very somber, wearing cloaks and doing something that has a real, if they were all about to drink the Kool-Aid, I imagine they would be behaving like this. And that idea of moving to a new place, I've got some cinematic comparisons here. That there's, I wrote The Long Goodbye, that romantic, that there's this becoming more distant, that the separation becomes so extreme that the separate parts are written informationally non-interacting. Kind of like how, if you traveled internationally a couple of 100 years ago, it takes months for letters to cross the sea. There's just no information flow between those places. You don't know where that person is. If they end up dead, you might never find out. It's just so far away and separate. So it was like waving someone off from the platform of a railway station, your loved one's departing, and it's like, bye, for a really long time.
So I think that this ceremony that David just described has something to do with what we mentioned in the first part of the show, and that is that there's a savior component to this, that the priest class of the society on Mars was going to end they realized their society was about to end. They couldn't sustain life where they were, and they were desperate. And so this move might have all been a desperate act to save their society and relocate it elsewhere, almost like a bit of a lifeboat. It turns out that David has some data in his session that relates to this concept of a lifeboat.
So I looked into the purpose or function of this departure, this waving someone off, the departing, I even said like a departing ship. I said, what's the function? There's a steering committee, they're sending something off, and this thing represents a goal or plan. And I had an AOL of like Columbus going to the New World, which I think is very apt. And this is optimistic, positive, pure. This is a good intention. They want to find a new place to live, which I've described as singular. Like, I guess they intend to live in one place. And I wrote, all mine, like somewhere they don't have to share, I guess, although I don't know what that means. And then that this was forever. This was designed to be as good as possible for as long as possible. It wasn't like we're just going to rent for 6 months and then find somewhere good to buy. It was like we're going to do this right and find somewhere that we can live as a civilization indefinitely. Some data I had a little bit later was that this race, were destined to survive. It's not their time to die yet. But then, really interestingly, I think Brett's going to go into more detail on this, information is preserved. Like, it's not the physical part of the civilization which survives, it's informational. So, Brett, why don't you tell us how on earth that works?
Yeah, so a really simplistic way of looking at this, just as from a starting point, the event itself happened in a flash. It was a snap of a finger, and everything is instantly dustified. Your body, the street corner itself, I mean, the tower 5 miles away was instantly turned to dust. And if you take the position that who and what we are as humans, or at this point, if you were a Martian, you're a spiritual being, not just a physical being, that if your body was to just immediately vanish, but your perception of a spiritual being was still there, you might be a little confused. And so this goes into the idea of life after death, which is what we were getting, at least especially what I was getting in the religious aspect. It was this life after death, this prolonging society's existence even after the physical form no longer existed. And it wasn't a natural destruction of the physical form, it was an intentional destruction of everyone's physical form. But they realized that in this plan of theirs, they needed a container or a ship, for lack of a better word. It's not a physical ship, but some sort of ship or container to sustain, maintain, and then transfer these spiritual beings to a new place and a new time. And what I discovered deep underground under Olympus Mons was a huge catacomb of tombs. And for lack of a better word, vacant bodies. These are bodies or forms that resemble a living life form, but nobody's home. They're artificially created and they look like, to, I guess, I suppose, a spiritual being, a body. And I want you just to imagine if you just immediately woke up and suddenly everything was gone, everything was vaporized, you don't have your body anymore. Perhaps one of the very first things you would look for is, where's my body? Or where's a body? And well, the nearest body was right there at the site, deep underground. And that this was intentional. This was designed in a way that it was an attractor for spiritual beings to come to it and then enter inside of it. And I've done other work in the past where I've seen these, they're not necessarily always physical, where these things act as kind of a honeypot. And I had that word in my remote viewing data, that this is kind of a trap for the non-physical being to come this way. This is where you want to come. And then once it sees the body, it begins identifying with it because it doesn't have one of its own yet. And once it's identified as the body, it's now stuck in the body. And that's what this attractor was intended to do for all the people that were instantly vaporized. And so it was like this little container waiting for all of the disincarnate beings that they had created that environment. Now, it doesn't end there, though, because you don't want all those beings to remember what just happened to them. You don't want them to remember that they just got vaporized by some interesting thing. Maybe it was their government or their priest class that did it to them. And I also got that in my first session, where there was a forgetting, a blanking of memory, where the emotional response was, what's the deal? A fuzziness, censoring of what occurred, false memory, implanted deception. It's like someone entering a hypnotic trance, hypnosis, the truth is obscured, and time is snatched from the individual, which is interesting because in this scenario, from the perception of this priest class that's doing this, where they were trying to get to, I believe, was Earth. But at that point in time, Earth was not habitable. So they needed kind of a way station for all of these spiritual beings to wait, and there's your time loss, and then be transported off to somewhere else. And I think this is kind of like the repository or the database. And so I'm describing like people are being uploaded into this artificial life form and held there for safekeeping until the time comes that they're then going to be sent or shipped off to a new place. So it's pretty wild technology. This is like spiritual technology, which nothing like that exists that I'm aware of. At least that's public, obviously, on planet Earth, but it's a type of spirit technology. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about this afterwards. But what this looks like and what this is commonly referred to is actually a Merkaba or Merkaba. Emily, I think you had something you want to mention on this point.
Right. So I find it super interesting that here we are on Earth in this time, and you hear these cultural leaders and billionaires talking about, oh, we have to save the human race. We have to go to Mars. And to me, it's very interesting. It's almost like a mirror of what has happened potentially in the past with the people of Mars coming to Earth. It's almost like there's this psychological trauma or this kind of collective subconscious drive to get off the planet. Even though I don't think Earth is anywhere near as bad as Mars was, it's just very interesting to me that there is this parallel. Obviously, the people on Mars were traveling not only across space, but across time, and they had a very different way of doing it. Right now, we're just proposing to send a small number of people over to Mars to start colonizing it there because we think it's ready to go. We'll see over time what actually ends up happening there. But I just wanted to introduce this concept of this collective trauma because I think there's a lot of different elements to this particular story that play out here on our planet. That let's just go with the theory for a moment that many beings here on this planet in this time are actually part of this group of beings that we're now referring to that are on Mars. And what type of trauma would that leave on those spiritual beings? Brett, I don't know if you want to speculate on this, or David, do you want to jump in and speculate on what traumas would be left behind?
Yeah, I do think it's interesting, Emily, that there's a really big push by a lot of people. There's a hypersensitivity towards saving the earth and that the earth is dying and oh my God. And obviously there is excess pollution. There is a lot of damage that is occurring, but there's almost, you talk to some people, they think that the world is just about to end right now and the earth can't support life anymore because of what we're doing. And that's just, the reality of that is that's not happening tomorrow. That's not true. But part of me wonders if there is an underlying trauma or a memory that is under the surface that they hold if they were one of those individuals, or maybe it's just so embedded. Maybe if they were successful and these spiritual beings came to Earth and began incarnating as humans and everything played off the way that they intended, it kind of became ingrained within the human psyche here, which is why some people have such a hyper reaction or hypersensitivity to this topic. I think it's plausible. It's a plausible story. But ultimately, what this does is this acts as a spiritual lifeboat. That's what this does, is you remove the physical bodies of the civilization, you store them for safekeeping, because you don't want those spiritual beings wandering off to other places in the universe. If you have no one to rule, well, then what are you going to do? You got to keep your subjects around and, blank their memory, make it so they don't remember what happens, and then send them in line to incarnate once the planet is ready or a specific time in the planet is ready. There's things I think later on, which I'll talk about, where there are other stories that say that they may have actually chosen the time in the future to look, but it is in a sense kind of a lifeboat. It's just not for your body. It was a lifeboat for their spiritual being.
So I mentioned in our public episode that I had the creation of life. When I inquired as to how this was done, they said, oh, it's really easy. You just mix up the ingredients. It's not as complex as it looks, but it sure looks complex to me. Some life that was being created that I detected associated with the space laser event, which I think may be the idea of actually seeding life. And presumably, I mean, all of this is going out on a big limb, but presumably on Earth. Because this life it's pale and it's artificial. Well, I said man-made. Who knows what man means in this context. But it's kind of energetic and chemically and sort of mechanical sounds. This isn't like normal life. But then it's a physical thing that exists. It's not a spiritual body. It has a body and it has a sense of self as an individual. But then looking at the physical dimensions of this thing, it's just like the sketch I've drawn looks like a cabbage or a pumpkin or a sea urchin or something. It's like this blob. And I said it's pale and translucent, self-contained together, curved, like a hedgehog rolled up. So what kind of life is this? I used the word incipient, which I couldn't even remember what that means, and it means just beginning or coming into existence. It's like proto-life, a blueprint, and this phrase, how it was always meant to be, physically exists. It's about reproduction and expansion, the rollout of a blueprint. And amusingly here I had an AOL of transhumanism, actually, which is kind of like a dirty reflection.
David, I think you also had you had this term panspermia, which for the audience who doesn't know what that means, that's this idea that life gets seeded across the universe, across different planets.
Yeah, that it falls out of the sky.
Exactly. I'm wondering if what you're referring to here isn't sort of the seeding of life on Earth itself, right? Maybe it's the beginning of life that came from Mars.
Well, this life is designed. This has a function. They're really keen on it. The feeling was, it's good, try it. And it was like when a salesperson actually really believes in their product. They're not being deceptive and saying this is good when it's not. They think this is great. This is the life with the purpose to improve, fight disease, everything better, silver bullet, wonderful thing. And it has details and complexities. It's a clear design, a clear purpose. The design is extremely specific to its purpose. It's got one job. I describe it as top-notch engineering. AOL of personalized medicine. This is so specific. But I felt it's so specific that it's maybe like it's not one size fits all. It's not generically good in all circumstances for all people. This is just from their opinion. This is totally amazing.
Is this the attractor that you're talking about? Do you believe that that's what's there?
No, this isn't. This is the life that is created. The attractor for me was associated with the people about to drink the Kool-Aid. Maybe it's sort of coincidental that I used the word attractor, but I just kind of got attracted by something and then went, where the hell am I now? And got these people.
Here's one postulate that potentially could include what you're describing as well as what I got, because I think you described something where it's like a faceless proto life form. Like it has no face, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's when I described it as looking like a cabbage or a sea urchin. That was my stage 3 visual sketch. And I thought, this looks weird. Have I got noise in my data? So I drew like an oval shape, just prompted myself, like, what's the face look like? And I just got a bunch of horizontal lines. It looks like a capsule or a box or nothing. So I think this thing, it's more like an egg or some kind of single-celled thing that's going to, like a fetus or an embryo or something.
So there's an interesting parallel between my work here as well, which is that there is a life form that is obscured. This is the identity removal. Person doesn't remember their face. And so that was the phrase that was associated with it. I don't remember my face. It's like my face was blurred out, blanking, forgetting, censoring, blurring, remembering, though, a false memory, implanted deception. And so follow along with me for just a second as far as a way maybe to piece these things together. We have an event where a tremendous amount of people are eliminated quickly, instantly. Let's just say that spiritual beings still exist even if their body no longer exists. They don't know what just happened. They're going to look for their body. The closest body that exists is one that's not alive in the sense that we would think a human body's alive. It's kind of this android, for lack of a better word, but maybe it's a biological form that's just being artificially kept alive with no spiritual being in it. It's just there. It's got maybe some blood vessels. It seems alive, but it's right there below the site. And that would act as an attractor to the spiritual beings that just lost their body and they have no idea why. When the spiritual being sees that and goes down into it, because it acts as an attractor for that, at least that's the way I look at it, and then merges with it, now you actually do have a life form that is created. It is the creation of a new life. It's just one that is completely artificially created. And what I described under the whole facility are just rows and rows and vast, deep tunnels and catacombs of these tombs of sleeping bodies under the ground. And I believe what my work was saying is that the spiritual beings got attracted to those, paired with them, if you will, and then sat within them until the time it was to send them out off somewhere else. And so it's almost like go sit in your little cage, but it's not described to them necessarily as a cage. It's described to them, they're spiritual beings. They're trying to figure out where's my body, and they go to the closest one. This is a bit of a stretch, but I believe that's where, if I was to take your data and my data, that's the narrative that emerges for me.
I have just spotted a single piece of data in my description of this life, which really matches up with what you've said there, which is my own personal emotional reaction to this, which is I disapprove of others' actions towards this life. I'd skipped over that. We don't usually regard that as data because it's just my subjective reaction, but I think that ties in nicely.
So it seems to me like what you're describing is almost like a stasis chamber. Like I'm thinking of those sci-fi movies where when they send humans to distant planets, they put them in almost like a cryogenic stasis. It's almost like suspended animation. And maybe this technology seemed very horrific to us, but the whole way this all went down was just the goal was to get these beings into this suspended animation inside this giant arc that when the time is right, off you go to Earth.
Yeah. And so I guess the next question is, well, how did they intend to, from that stasis chamber or pod, whatever it is, this artificial life form, how did you get from that stasis to Earth? Well, first of all, it would have to survive until Earth was ready. There's the time loss. It's time traveling by waiting. They waited in stasis until the time was right to be transferred over here. And what showed up in both of our sessions, it just came out by itself. I think for David, it just showed up where it's like, oh, this just seems to be important. I probably should write it down. And for me, it also showed up in a very similar way associated with the actual transferring of the information. I drew what looked like the Star of David, and that was directly tied also to the religious aspects as well. And there's an interesting thing about the Star of David is that there are a lot of things in modern culture and modern religion that have meanings with that, but there's actually a much more ancient one. And what that matches is referred to as the Merkaba, or and sometimes it's called the Merkava as well. I believe it actually originated from ancient Egyptian, and it means chariot. So the modern understanding of that word is that Merkaba means a light spirit body. It's an energy sphere in which things exist and can act as a vehicle to carry you from one dimension of reality to another. Now, if that doesn't just fit exactly with what is going on here in this grand narrative of transferring spiritual beings in the process.
So I just want to take a time out here and bring something up. Some of you listeners might be feeling a little bit of anxiety around this particular story. And I think that it's something that can come up when we're dealing with these topics. There may be a reason why this anxiety is coming that actually is beyond your current lifetime. You may have been involved in this event. And I think that it's important to perhaps talk about that. Maybe, David, you can share some ideas on if this is occurring to one of our listeners, what can they do if all of a sudden they're very, I don't want to use, it's overused these days, the word triggered, but if they are triggered by this story and it seems to ring very true to them, what could they do to deal with those emotions?
Well, I think Brett is the expert on that topic. I just want to talk about triggering a little bit before we go into details of what you can do, because death is a difficult subject, right? We all have negative ideas and experiences around death, either in a everyday kind of sense, like bereavement, or if you want to be more spiritual or metaphysical about it, there's this sort of psychic imprint of lingering trauma from past lives or other people's lives, or there's a lot of negativity around death of the physical body which floats around us. And you can have these things, these traumas embedded in you, kind of like a splinter, and if you have a splinter of wood in you and you catch the tip that protrudes, suddenly it really hurts and you go, ow, what the hell? When if you don't just irritate that, it doesn't hurt most of the time. It won't bother you so much. But the solution is to pull it out, dig it out, and remove that. I know all three of us here have had points in our life where, especially with the esoteric stuff to do with death and reincarnation, and there's some very scary ways of looking at these topics which can leave you feeling very alone and powerless to do anything about it. And all three of us are sat here now perfectly comfortable with these ideas and okay with it. So I just want everybody, if you are feeling freaked out by it, be confident that it is possible to remove that splinter or those splinters, plural, and get to a place where you can look at this and go, well, that's interesting, maybe, and not feel an emotional reaction to it. So hopefully Brett will now tell us how to deal with this stuff.
Well, there's two ways I would go about it. First one's really simple, and that's just turn your attention to something else. If you want to avoid the splinter pain, go watch a movie and put your attention somewhere else. I don't imagine this would be too triggering to most people, but it is the rare case, and this is just us trying to be responsible in sharing this information, then the easiest thing would be to turn off the episode, come back to it later, perhaps after you've done some other stuff. So that's one, change your attention. Pretty straightforward. The second thing, though, that I would recommend is if you are finding yourself having a strong reaction to this kind of information, figure out where it is in your body first. It may be in your stomach, like a heart dropping into your stomach kind of feeling. It's usually somewhere in the body first. And my recommendation is over time, set some time aside and put your attention on that body feeling that you have, and then think about this topic. And then whatever comes into mind, begin writing that out on a piece of paper and begin kind of dumping that. See, in remote viewing, we do this thing called AOLing. It's a way to take out the trash when we're trying to get to what's behind it in remote viewing data. But you can use a similar technique where you just use expressive writing as an outlet for that charge, for that pressure that's building up, creates that sense of unease. So that's what I would do. And then you just do a little bit of that at a time. Do a little bit more writing, do a little bit more writing. And then whatever images show up in your mind, use that as a valve to empty that out. And the more you do that, it will lessen that body feeling so that it's not as intense. And you may find some interesting things that are in your memory that are presented to yourself. I've done this on many occasions where I actually get full past lives start coming through. And I've done a lot of other meditative techniques, which is kind of grease the wheels for this kind of thing. But you may find some interesting visuals that you're having an emotional response to. And it's not an emotion that you're creating willfully, it's one that's just there. And the way you go through it is you allow it to come into your space in present time, acknowledge it. And then once you can see it in front of you on a piece of paper, well, you can let go of that piece of paper. It's just a story at that point. It's no longer something under the surface, which is really where the power comes from. The power of this stuff can affect you negatively because you don't know what it is that's causing the feeling. The moment you understand what's causing the feeling, the images that are associated with it, it loses its power. Sometimes it's helpful to do this with somebody else too. Seek out a professional to talk to about it, or even a friend maybe who's really good at listening that can listen without judgment. But that's what I would do if you're running into this kind of situation and you're having kind of an extreme reaction to it.
Thanks. Those are some very comprehensive and good points on this, which reminded me about our first episode going off the deep end, because in our after hours segment for that episode, we've suggested quite a lot of practical tips and tools. I think the meditation that you described in that episode, Brett, involves focusing on a difficult emotion. So you could go back and listen to that and give that a try. That's a worthwhile thing to do. I just want to add, if you are experiencing strong negative emotional reactions to stuff like this or any other topic, that can cloud your ability to kind of approach it in a down-to-earth, rational way. We make less good decisions when we're afraid. So it really pays off to make sure that you're approaching something from an emotionally neutral point of view before you go too far into the woo-woo.
Bringing us back to the topic of today's episode, I wanted to take the conversation on a bit of a tangent. So there were some patterns that emerged. If you remember back when we mentioned there's not just this Olympus Mons structure, but there's actually 3 other slightly smaller mountain structures in a pattern. We started looking at this pattern. We've been looking at satellite imagery of Mars, and one of the things that jumped out at us, I was talking to Brett about his session, and both of us just sort of thought, hey, this is a lot like the pattern we see on the Giza Plateau with the big 3 pyramids laid out on the plateau. And of course, some of our listeners will be familiar with that there's theories that actually is a mirror in the sky of Orion's belt. And we noticed a few other similarities. Brett, did you want to get into what we found when we started looking at this? This is something that I don't think I've heard in any other podcast or any other theory before. It's something that I think we've just put these pieces together based on our RV data.
Yeah, so on Mars, there's the 3 smaller structures that are in a line, and then Olympus Mons is at a right angle from the center one. So it makes like this triangle shape. When you look at the pyramids on Giza, obviously there's the 3 pyramids. It's much smaller in scale, but I had this inclination, well, let's say this was a mirror of what's going on Mars and not Orion's belt, or maybe it's both. Well, then what's in the place of where we'd expect Olympus Mons to be, but in relationship to the pyramids on Giza? And that's when we looked at the map, and where it actually lands directly is the Giza Plateau. And what happens to be right at the base of the Giza Plateau is a massive cemetery, and underground tombs litter the area. So there's an interesting correlation between what we discovered under Olympus Mons, which I described this vast network of tombs of these kind of artificial life forms that captured and were attractors for all of the disincarnate beings after they were vaporized. And they went in there and they basically were held there before they were sent off to Earth through a very strange form of Merkaba technology, spiritual technology. But then also here mirrored in Egypt is in the same place that you'd expect Olympus Mons to be in relationship to Giza. You'd find a massive underground area and network of tombs as well. So I don't know if this is a coincidence. It sure is a pretty big coincidence, but it's almost like you could make the argument that this cemetery and the ancient tombs in that location is almost like a memorial to what happened on Olympus Mons, however many millions, or I don't know, however long that event actually occurred. It mimics a little bit of what happened there and what is there. So it was very fascinating finding that.
So if it is a memorial Do you think this memorial was done sort of with full conscious intent of this particular memory or homage to Mars? Or do you think it's maybe more along the lines of some sort of a collective subconscious sort of a trauma thing that's just people did this because it's in this collective memory of this past trauma? What do you think?
It could be a bit of both. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a bit of a collective trauma thing because there is a modern day cemetery stacked right on top of this ancient tomb. The Giza Plateau, also interestingly, you're really not allowed to go in there. The government doesn't allow it, but there's a lot of tunnels and caves and networks of underground systems in that plateau that is understood to be there, that it's off limits. You can't go down there. Well, how interesting that also in my RV data, underneath Olympus Mons, there are all these underground networks of tunnels and caves. It's just, I think it might be both. I think it might be someone maybe knew a long time ago, which is why they built the tombs there. But maybe today there's like an unconscious memory of the event, and this is a memorial.
Well, there's that phrase, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, which is kind of a exoteric observation on this phenomenon that there are apparently bigger patterns and cycles going along below the surface of we're here experiencing physical reality with linear time and this crazy idea about causality working like billiard balls and stuff. And I think outside of that space that we're experiencing, there's subtler things going on. So mirroring and echoes and reflections, we're seeing just a whole ton of that stuff with this project. This is it's a big deal what happened on Olympus Mons, right? This was a terrible event. So this is just burned into the solar system in a way, isn't it? Like this is, how long ago was this? I wrote the word eons in my session. Like I couldn't say more than that, but it happened that long ago. And here we are, we're still talking about it. It's that big a deal, right? It's there below the surface and it's going to bubble up in, the people who put their dead relatives in that cemetery in Giza, right? They didn't go, where shall I bury them? It's just collectively people decided cemetery goes here, right? This is the right place for the cemetery. Don't know why, but here it is.
So I believe that there are probes or scientific uncoveries on Mars where there's sort of like a liquefied sand that's turned to glass that some people have speculated is a nuclear blast that occurred approximately 500,000 to a million years ago, if I'm not mistaken. But this could all be tied to the same event that we're looking at. So this eons thing would have been hundreds of thousands of years, if not into the million-year time horizon, or possibly longer, just a speculation.
There's the remote viewing work done, I believe, by Joe McMoneagle back in, when was that, the 70s or 80s, which was 1 million years ago, Mars. And he ended up speaking with some people who I think they were kind of sleeping, weren't they? And they had sent a lifeboat out. And the coordinates were not Olympus Mons, as far as I know, but it seems like this is a very similar story. They were sad that it was climate change, the planet was wrecked. They'd sent somebody out to find a new place to live, and they were just going to kind of chill and wait until they came back. And where that story left off, I believe they were still waiting.
The million-year figure is interesting because it's not just other remote viewing data that seems to match some of our work of like the sleeping souls under the surface of Mars. And there's this artificial technology that's keeping them alive until the right time. And who knows, maybe some of them are still there. And some, our work is describing, at least I believe my work is saying that some of those actually came to Earth and they incarnated as human beings in their future. But there's an interesting story that comes completely unrelated to remote viewing, and it comes from something I've viewed at in the past, but it's referred to as the Urantia book. And this is a story of channeled texts from, I believe, multiple people, but they have a very specific story in there about Mars, about the Merkaba, and about reincarnation of the Martian people in Atlantis, of all places. So I just want to read one little part here from this text, just to give you a little snippet of it. So the text starts, about 1 million years ago, the race on Mars was dying. The planet was terminating from external Merkabas run amok. Through the creation of an elegant external time-space vehicle, other Merkabas, the Martians were able to journey into space, travel in time, and discover and decide the perfect time and place for them to re-enter. They saw projected far ahead in their future, about 65,000 years in our current past, a place on planet Earth called Atlantis. So perfect and waiting for them. That is where they were headed. They stepped in against Earth humans' will and tried to take over immediately, but they were too few and they failed. So there's a very interesting story in that book, which seems to echo, I can't corroborate this book or the story, but I think it's an interesting echo of our work, is that there was a species, a race that existed on Mars, that they destroyed their planet. They had some sort of a energetic spiritual lifeboat that then they transferred that here to Earth long in their future. And it's just funny when we see other things emulated in other works that rhymes.
So it seems like not only were they trying to move across space and time, but they were actually aiming at not just a particular place, but actually aiming at reappearing at a particular time of their choosing or that they thought was advantageous. Have you uncovered in any of your research or any of your readings of the Urantia book why they might have chosen Atlantis supposedly around that time, 65,000 years ago? And if they did, maybe let's speculate for a minute. Let's say they did choose that and that story is true. What would have been the effect or the consequence of them appearing at this time here?
Well, the story goes in the Urantia book, and again, I can't attest for this story. It's just a story. This isn't RV data. But it's interesting to talk about, I think, because the way it goes in the story is that the Atlanteans were much more right-brained. They had much more of a feminine energy associated with them. They were not left-brained science. They were right-brained spirituality. And so when the Martians supposedly appeared here, there was a lot of conflict. They wanted to take over by force, but there just weren't enough of them. And so that makes me wonder, again, this is just speculation. Well, maybe due to the nature of the failed experiment on Mars, maybe the entire society didn't end up here on Earth. Maybe only a couple ended up here. And at least in comparison to perhaps millions and millions of people that are still asleep on Mars that never made it, that are still in stasis. So according to the story of the Urantia book, though, there was a lot of tension in between the Martians and the Atlanteans. And the story that plays out in the Urantia book is that there's another catastrophe that's coming that they discovered, which was an impact of a meteor on Earth. And the Martians said, well, we have the technology to make sure it doesn't impact Earth. But the Atlanteans said, no, it's God's will. We should let it happen. And so they let it happen. And as the story goes, actually more Martians were harmed by it than Atlanteans. How much of this is true? I don't know. I don't know why they would choose Atlantis other than maybe it was the closest to their time and technology. I can only speculate at that point, but you have to read more. It's been a while since I've done a deep dive on the Urantia book, but it was similar to this.
There is this idea that Atlantis, Lemuria, whatever other ones there are like, they are separate eons. They're separate stages of evolution of the cosmos or the solar system. So it's not the same kind of place to be in. Back then, the humans are different, physics is different, everything is just a little bit less evolved, or maybe just different back then, right? So maybe instead of it being 65,000 years ago, our time, it's like around the corner. It's not, you don't just go back in a straight line and suddenly you get the Martians incarnating. You're actually going back and then stop and you hop into the previous epoch when planet Earth was just totally different. The solar system was different. Speculation. I think maybe, Emily, you want to get into some Rudolf Steiner anthroposophy stuff on that topic on another day.
Yeah, David, I definitely think we'll get into some Rudolf Steiner works as well as some of the other things related to Earth epochs, the Yuga cycles, and the even the Eighth Sphere, perhaps. And I think in the Urantia book, Brett, correct me if I'm wrong, there was mention of Luciferian energies or rebellions, and Steiner even gets into that. He had this notion of Luciferian being on one end of a spectrum, and on the other end of a spectrum, something that he called Armon, which was the left brain. and how you actually want to balance this yin and the yang and the left and the right brain to get to a certain state of harmony. So it's not clear if the Urantia book is talking about these things literally, or if maybe there's an element of metaphorical storytelling going on as well.
It is in there. Yeah. I didn't go into those details because I don't know how pertinent it was to this discussion on Mars. But the story of the Urantia book goes that the reason for why the planet Mars was so messed up was due to this, what's just loosely called Luciferian rebellion, which is not what you think it is. It's not, it's a very different type of story, which maybe we'll get into a different day. It's not the biblical precise story of like, oh, an angel and a demon and things like that. It's a lot more complex. It has to do with, should beings be allowed free will or not? And that it would be better if there was no free will. And so it comes down to that in a much higher way. But the story in the Urantia book is that the Martians destroyed their planet because they were creating these external Merkabas, and which was devoid of love and the light and higher spirituality, and therefore it sucked in and destroyed as opposed to created. Maybe subject again for another show, because there's a lot to go in there.
That's interesting you mentioned that it was like devoid of love, because I certainly felt in my session data, those priest people, they were, I struggled to find the word for it, but I said emotionally muted in the end, but it was like they just had less emotional range than we do as modern humans. They just didn't feel the same way we do.
So could this have been the case that this priest class actually brought upon themselves some super negative karma? Like they thought they were going to pull off this thing, and they actually ended up creating this disaster, that the disaster kind of spun out of control because of their incorrect use of this technology?
Perhaps this is the inevitable outcome of taking or allowing the Ahrimanic influence to kind of become a positive feedback loop, and that's where we'll end up with Elon Musk's transhumanist Martian thing, and they'll just blow themselves up all over again.
It's just a repeating of history. It's just, if you haven't cleared the trauma, if you haven't figured out the reason why you had the catastrophe in the first place, you're doomed to replicate a new version of it. This happens just in your everyday life. If you don't handle a trauma from childhood, then it's very often that you're going to re-dramatize that in your life in some other way. And who's to say that's not exactly what humanity is trying to do again, but through the lens of Mars and trying to get to another planet again. And oh no, the planet Earth is dying when it's not dying. We're certainly not being good stewards of it, but it's not like tomorrow we're in fear of everything being incinerated, that's the world that the Martians, it seems, were living on. Everything was over for them. And maybe that's just deep now embedded within the human psyche once the Martians began incarnating here. At least that's the postulate.
Yeah, I mean, this trauma is so big. If you think of classical and magical cosmology, what is Mars associated with? It's the god of war. The Martian spirits are all martial kind of spirits. Mars is a shorthand for violence and war and probably left brain. I'm not sure whether that's true, that it's left brain, but war. That's our word for the planet, is our word for armed conflict. So they must have really screwed up, right?
There's also this element that we touched on at the very beginning, and that was they may have had a genuine problem with resources and a genuine problem with overpopulation. And I wonder to what extent, when we're talking about traumas and people projecting their traumas and collective unconscious traumas, reminds me of things like we see on the Georgia Guidestones, where there's this class of people on the planet that seem hell-bent on a depopulation agenda. And Earth isn't overpopulated. We're very bad at managing our resources, for sure. But if resources are managed in an intelligent way, there are plenty to go around. And so it's not a real problem they're trying to solve, but I wonder to what extent they're trying to solve this sort of this karmic problem, or this kind of like psychological, subconscious problem that they're repeating from a past era.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up this After Hours episode. Thank you, Emily, for this interesting target. It was it's not what any of us expected. I think even you included. But, kind of a final musing thought that I have based on some other work that maybe in the future we'll talk about, is, a million years is a long time. If this spiritual technology of sending souls from one planet to another through time and all this wild woo stuff were just sitting somewhere with no one at the helm, who's to say that some other agency didn't come along and maybe hijack that process for their own ends? Maybe we'll touch on that in a future episode, but I suppose it's a possibility, something to leave you wondering with. And maybe that has to do with Moksha. I guess we'll see. So with that, thank you for joining us. We'll see you in the next Cypher podcast. Take care, everybody.